This episode is presented by Invest Puerto Rico. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. Hello, and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. Today is May 17th, 2024. I'm Ann Azevedo, and joining me today is TC reporter Haje Kamps. Haje, how's it going? How's your week been?
You know what? My week has been nuts. I woke up to Elon Musk tweeting out a video I created for TechCrunch at Google I/O, and 36 million views later, my mentions are interesting? Question mark. But it's been really good, and it's been a good high energy week.
36 million views? Seriously?
Yeah, kind of nuts, huh?
That's crazy. That's crazy. Wow. We're going to talk more about that later, though. Also joining us today is senior TechCrunch reporter on the Venture Beat and co-host of our sister podcast, Found, Becca Szkutak. Becca, how's it going for you?
Oh, hanging in there, but happy to be here. How are you, Marianne?
I am the same and happy that you both are here as well. Before we get to the show rundown, want to ask our listeners, please don't forget to rate and review Equity on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever your preferred pod streamer is. We really appreciate it. Now, today we've got a packed show. I can't wait to get into all of it. First of all, deals of the week. We're talking about Layer, Spore, and Pay HOA. Then we're going to look at AI's very busy week and discuss why VCs are still playing musical chairs. So, Haje, tell us all about Layer. It's a fintech, so of course, I'm curious to hear more details about this company.
Yeah, so Layer just announced that they raised $2.3 million, and they're kind of gunning for QuickBooks King of the Hill status. And I'm pretty psyched about it, actually. They're kind of embedding accounting into pretty commonly used platforms for small and medium-sized businesses, like Square and like Toast. And the company is planning to deploy all of this funding into expanding its services to make sure that additional small businesses can use that across lots of different software platforms.
I think that's pretty fascinating. But my first question was, is this not already being done?
Well, you'd be amazed, but somehow it isn't. I feel like a lot of the people are kind of building their own integrations between QuickBooks or Xero or whatever it is they're using and their tools. And it's a bit of a mess. I've run a whole bunch of different businesses myself, and that part of it has always been a massive pain in the butt.
Now, they just raised $2.3 million in pre-seed money. I think Better Tomorrow Ventures.
That's right.
That raise. Okay. Not a lot of money, but they're still very early stage. I think they only have about 4 customers. Is that right?
Something in that range, yeah. I mean, what I really love about it is that they're really gunning for a slice of the market where very young businesses don't really want to have to deal with this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a cool take on it.
I love their confidence, to be honest with you. They're not intimidated. QuickBooks has been around for a long time. It's kind of just one of those things where I think businesses feel like they don't really have other options, so they just use it. No offense, QuickBooks, but that's kind of the impression that I get. And I love the confidence of these founders because they feel like, you know what? There's been a shift in how SMBs run their businesses. We can disrupt this. And it's a huge market. There's definitely room for more players. So I love that they are undeterred by the fact that QuickBooks has kind of this stronghold in the market and they're just going at it.
Yeah. Well, what I love about it is that they're doing like real disruption, right? They're coming at this market from a completely different angle. I feel like a lot of these kinds of businesses like QuickBooks came out of like kind of the sages of the world, right? The kind of enterprise era of accounting, right? Where big accounting firms have these tools that they use and they know how to use. But the smaller businesses were like, oh God, do we really have to go this deep into accounting? And so companies like FreshBooks and QuickBooks and Xero came along and made it a lot easier, but it was still kind of coming at it from the accounting angle. The novelty here is that they're coming at it from the startup angle. It's like, hey, you just want to run your business. Well, here's kind of the accounting layer on top of that. And so reaching into the market from a different angle, I think gives them a really interesting opportunity.
Yeah, I was going to say similar because I think there's been, over the last couple of years, especially since COVID, there have been a lot more companies building for small businesses in mind. And I definitely agree that it's good to build from that approach because, of course, if you are a small business, but you want to grow into a big business, it would seem easy like, oh, I'll work with this enterprise software company that's designed for the bigger guys and I will grow into it. But there's a lot of value in having stuff just aimed for the company and the size that you're at, the things you actually need, and doing those things well. And so like, I definitely like this concept because I think it could be the kind of thing where instead of coming from that top-down approach, people could get into working with Layer, and Layer could eventually expand to offer that kind of stuff as they grow. And so I really like this idea because I think it's so easy to say that small businesses can just use the big software, just use the stuff available for big businesses, but it's just not always the best fit.
No, it's not. And interestingly, their customers so far range in industries including truck drivers to medical spas. And they collectively work, even though there's only 4 of them, collectively work with over 100,000 small businesses, which, wow, that's a lot. And before we move on, I want to just also point out this quote that the co-founder, Justin Meritab, he was quoted as saying in the story that he was surprised at how many SMB users tell them that the embedded accounting views that they're able to see by using Layer is actually the first time that they've ever seen a clear profit and loss view of their business. So I was like, wow, that's crazy. Like you would think that that would just be, there with anything the company would be using.
Yeah, I've experienced that firsthand a number of times with my own companies where, all the stuff, all the nuts and bolts that happens behind the scenes. And then, an analyst has to go in and actually give you your report. And I'm like, why is that a thing? Like, this is something that the software should be able to do itself.
Exactly.
I think this is where you see the difference. If you think like an accountant, this makes sense. But if you think like a small business owner, you're like, I just want to know how much money I made this month. You kind of come at it from a different angle. And I think it's such a good, I love that.
Our readers seem to like this too. The story's been performing really well, which goes to show you that it's not always the massive rounds that get the most attention. So Becca, would love to hear more about Spore, which you wrote about this week. It's got a really unique model and it also raised some money.
And just leading off of your point, it also raised a small amount of money. Spore just raised $4 million this week. Spore is a Oslo, Norway-based startup that uses AI to help wind farms mitigate their impact on local bird populations, which I think is super interesting because obviously wind farms, wind turbines, which I learned doing this piece, I actually didn't know. Like I knew wind power was a growing aspect of like the energy grid in the US, but I actually did not realize that it is the largest source of renewable energy in the US currently. So super important because the major problem that wind farm expansion is being held up by is birds, especially in the US, the American bald eagle. So when you go to build a wind farm here, you have to follow a ton of different guidelines. And there are multiple things that are specifically related to birds that wind farms have to report on. They have to make sure certain sites aren't going to be particularly devastating because Spore can make a big difference here, not only for setting up a new wind farm, like, okay, we've got 2 potential sites. Let's set up this tech, which uses AI and computer vision to sort of track camera footage to see birds come in. They'll just mark the birds. They can predict their flight patterns, the migration patterns to get a better feel of when there'll be bird traffic in these areas. But existing wind farms can use this too, because if they notice, this specific type of bird comes through here every April for 2 weeks, they can either slow down their wind turbines to make less of a chance for a bird to collide with them, or they can just shut them off entirely and just kind of take that factor out. And I just thought this was so interesting. I love the intersection of AI and climate. And I mean, talking about using AI to protect birds from wind turbines, this just interested me in so many different ways.
Becca, what a great find. I have to admit, I've never really thought about this before. I mean, I've even driven by wind farms. And it never really occurred to me how birds and their migration patterns and all of that, how that could influence anything going on a wind farm. And also the fact that it could endanger their populations. Of course, it makes perfect sense, like 100%, but I just never thought about it. So this is really fascinating.
I'm enough of a nerd that when I'm driving around, I'm like counting how long it takes for one of those wings to go around. And I Googled at some point, how long are these arms on these wind turbines? And it turns out the tips of them can, like if it's on a windy day, they can spin at like 180 miles an hour. You don't want to be a bird getting hit by one of those arms.
Oh, wow.
And that's the reason I thought it was hilarious that reduce the impact. Yeah, that's what we're doing here. But, it's massively dangerous for birds. And so I think it's really cool that they're able to apply some technology to this.
Yeah. And I got sent this one from one of their backers, Superorganism, which is a VC fund based over here in their US. It was actually the only US backer in the round. And their whole thing and why they were like, Spore fits our thesis perfectly is they're looking at ways we can continue with our climate goals, continue with getting emissions down, getting to net zero emissions, but doing so in ways that doesn't harm nature and biodiversity in the process, which seems kind of like a niche thesis. I remember I covered the launch of the fund a couple of months ago, but then talking to a company like Spore, it's like, well, this is exactly how people should be approaching this, because like what good is getting to net zero emissions if you're like taking out all these animal populations, destroying habitats, like in the process. So yeah, I think this is super interesting, and they're getting a ton of demand already despite being very young. So it'll be interesting to see where they go from here.
Yeah, I bet you'll be hearing back from them again sooner rather than later. So my deal of the week was actually a larger round. So it was a $27.5 million Series A, but it caught my attention for a couple of reasons. It was a startup based out of Kentucky. For one, we rarely get to cover startups out of Kentucky. And I always really love covering raises or companies that are outside of the traditional tech or startup hubs. They don't get enough attention, in my opinion. This one's called Pay HOA. And I bet you can guess it has a business related to HOAs. Specifically, it's software that is designed for self-managed homeowner associations to help them it kind of acts as a central hub for like the board members who handle finances, maintenance requests, communication with their communities. So first off, if you've ever had to deal with HOAs, you know it can be a real big pain in the you know what. So having an HOA that has software that helps them better manage everything as a person who has to deal with them seems great. And they're growing a lot. Another thing that caught my attention about this company, and this always interests me, it's been bootstrapped for 6 years before it decided to raise venture capital. And it's profitable and bootstrapped and based out of Kentucky and growing. All these things caught my attention. So, okay, I'll stop talking for now.
There's a really interesting thing about that. And, when I'm talking to founders, especially founders who are outside the major tech hubs, like it's great that they are bootstrapped. And a lot of the time they kind of have to be, right? Because they really struggle to get the attention of the investors until they show like, hey, we're doing something really important here. And the most important way you can show that is with traction, right? So being bootstrapped, being profitable, showing all these things, now they're at a place where like, hey, we understand what our customer base is. If we now go and raise almost $30 million, we know what the next few steps are. That makes for a really powerful story when you're out there pitching.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's a great point. The company says it grew 70% year over year revenue last year, has more than 652,000 users. In fact, one of our reporters commented that he was familiar with it and it worked fine. So that just goes to show you that it is prevalent. And prices are pretty reasonable. It seems like they start at $49 per month for HOAs with 25 units or less. So not a surprise that this would attract the attention of investors. Personally, if I were an investor, I would be drawn to something like this. Think about all the startups, AI included, and specifically that are just bleeding cash, don't have much revenue, really just burning like crazy. And they're raising hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay. I mean, to me, this seems like a much better bet.
Yeah. And I was going to say, similar to what Haje said earlier about a lot of the companies outside these traditional hubs generally end up being profitable or bootstrapping before taking VC. I've definitely noticed that, especially more recently, that I'm talking to a lot more companies at the earlier stages who are profitable than I was a couple of years ago. And I just think I totally agree with you, Marianne, in the sense of like, if you're a venture investor coming in and you've got this company that's like, we're profitable, which means people are paying for this because people want this. It's like, you couldn't really get a better example of product market fit. Like the product fits enough that people are buying it. The company's profitable and bringing some money to scale. And the only other thing I'll mention that I thought was super interesting was about the CEO. Mm-hmm. He must have a thing for starting like niche accounting type, or not accounting, but like niche, like management business. I saw the other company he started was focused on fraternity and sorority financial management. As someone who is in a sorority, that would have been really helpful.
Right. Yeah, I love it. He has a finance degree. He started 2 other companies, the one you mentioned and another called file990.org. and they both sold to another company and together work in 2018. Also, another thing that caught my attention here, by the way, Elephant Ventures led this round. I don't know if I mentioned that, but you talked about product market fit, and he said that's exactly why the company decided to raise outside capital for the first time. He felt like it had reached a critical inflection point, found product market fit, was growing really fast, and decided, having that additional capital and some investor guidance could help guide the business to the next level.
The interesting thing that pops to my mind is like, what is the upper bounds of this market? Like, there's a lot of HOAs out there for sure, but if you're starting to charge $50 a month to HOAs, I am struggling to see how this is a truly venture scale business. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this shakes out and whether this turns out to be a good investment for the investors, right? I have no doubt that this could be a very profitable business that can grow quite a bit, but could it be a multi-billion-dollar company? I just don't know. So I'll definitely keep an eye on this one.
My counterpoint to that would be, I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but the vast majority of new homes built in the US last year were built into HOA communities, which is frustrating as someone who plans on buying a weird looking house and stuff like that. But it is, and I think the majority of new homes, unfortunately, do get built into HOA communities, which is at least a good sign. I agree with you. Of course, there is a cap to stuff like this, but it's a good sign for a potential market.
And to be a contrarian, I don't think every company has to be a multi-billion-dollar business to be successful. It could still be really successful and maybe even exit in another way so that investors might still get a good return.
Ooh, I'm going to have to pick a fight with you on that one. Basically, if a business cannot be a multi-billion-dollar business, it just doesn't fit the venture model, right? Like if it doesn't fit into the overall thing that venture capitalists need to do. Remember that most of the VC-funded companies fail. So a hit needs to at least have a possibility of being a massive hit. Becca just kind of shot me down on that one. Maybe it's a much bigger opportunity than I thought. But yeah, I think like if you're out there raising money and you don't have a fair shot at being a multi-billion-dollar company, VC is not for you.
Well, we'll see, right? We'll see what happens with Page.
Let's do a side bet on this one. I'm in.
Let's check in with them in about a year.
If you want the exact numbers, 66% of newly completed homes in 2022 were part of HOA communities, which compares to 17% in 2011.
Okay, I changed my mind. I'm all in.
That's a lot. Wow.
I sit lazily corrected.
That's a lot. Thanks for that, Becca. So after the break, we'll be digging into AI's very, very busy week. Both OpenAI and Google had major announcements, and we'll dig into that after this short break. What's next in tech? That's not the right question. It's where. Puerto Rico, where an entrepreneurial ecosystem pulses with connectivity, capability, and possibility, where the most competitive tax incentives in the U.S. fast-track success, and hard work is rewarded with sunsets and turquoise waters. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. investpr.org/TechCrunch. So Haje, you mentioned earlier on in the show, Elon Musk tweeted out a video that you created for TechCrunch at Google I/O. What was this video about? Why did it get so much attention?
So I did a really silly thing. Basically, towards the end of the show, they made a point on stage, like, hey, we've just mentioned AI 120 times. And of course, then the ticker went up to 121. And, that is a lot of AI in a 2-hour span. And I had this harebrained idea, which was, what if I took the 2-hour keynote and edited out everything that wasn't the word AI? So in 50 seconds, you heard people go AI, 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 AI. But, it's just a reminder of how incredibly AI focused a tech giant like Google is right now. And they're not the only ones. Everybody is like all in on AI.
Yeah, one thing that I noticed this week about OpenAI and Google's announcements is there were a lot of similarities in what they announced, right? One of the things that they were talking about is how their bots can now do things like actually answer questions in real time, which wasn't capable before. I can't keep up. It's too much. I mean, there's a lot going on. One of the things like ChatGPT always had this voice mode, but now it's I always say this wrong. GPT-4o supercharges that, right? So now users can actually interact with it more like an actual assistant than just a passive exchange, I guess.
So interesting to think about that because it's like, I always see these updates and I go, oh, no, like not for me. Like I've never used ChatGPT. I'm probably like the only person who works here that probably will just like get me fired for saying that. But I do think it's funny, like talking to it like an assistant and stuff. And I'm like, well, I'm the kind of person where if you send me a long voice memo text, I will respond to it like we're having a conversation because I will forget it's not an actual conversation. So
yeah.
All this stuff is so cool, but it's like, is it just me who can't find use cases for these things? I know everyone uses this, but I'm like, what is the extent of features like people are actually looking for?
Yeah, because it's upgrading its vision capabilities too. So for example, if you provide a photo or like a desktop screen, it can do things like answer questions like what's going on in the software code or what brand of shirt is this person wearing, stuff like that.
Well, and assisted vision stuff. If you say, hey, just say what you see and point your camera out into the world, it will give a running commentary of what you see. Hey, the light just turned green. Oh, there's a bus coming. Like that kind of thing. It is truly incredible to see all of that in action. I have spent a lot of time creating AI tools. And, I am a nerd. I love coding. And I just upgraded a bunch of the tools I built to ChatGPT 4.0. It is extraordinary what a big leap forward that was. ChatGPT 4 was always good, but it was very slow. And the speed increase is like, it's almost real time. It is absolutely spooky how fast that thing is now. I was talking to Steve Blank a while back, and he was saying, look, we are finding flaws in this technology, but it's been around for 5 years. It's like reviewing a toddler, right? It's like,
right.
We are so early in this stage, and we're seeing leaps and bounds of improvement. I think the early adopters, the people who are curious, have had their curiosity scratched. I think we're about to see a step into where people who are mainstream, who don't really have an interest in AI for the sake of technology, are now seeing real benefits-driven use cases for AI. And I think that's going to get real interesting.
I think so too. And I mean, Gemini Live, which is Google's new AI experience, also says, users can have these in-depth voice chats with Gemini on their smartphones. And like you said, can see and respond to surroundings, which is crazy and kind of spooky to me. Like that just makes me feel sort of weird to imagine, that Gemini could see and respond to where I am, what I'm doing. But I think that's mostly through a photo or a video. But another thing that is interesting about what Gemini is doing is it can analyze, summarize, and answer questions about really long documents. And when I say really long, I'm talking about up to 1,500 pages. So that kind of caught my attention because I'm not a big, I admit it, Becca, too. I'm not like a big user of either of these things, but to give it a document that's super long and have it summarize and analyze it for me, now that's super appealing.
I didn't actually know how much data it could take, so that's really interesting. Now I want to feed it the entire Bible and see if we can get a rap opera back. That's my next project.
Just feed infinite jest into it.
No. The poor thing. Let's not do that to it.
Make it learn on that.
What do you think this means for startups, though, all this innovation by the big companies?
I think it's super interesting. I think for a hot minute there, everybody was putting AI into everything, right? And they saw, oh, this is what we're doing now. This is the opportunity. I think a lot of the large companies are doing the picks and shovel stuff, like NVIDIA building the chips, all the people building the large language models and that kind of thing. Where startups are able to innovate is if they can add something that the large companies can't. That's actually a really big challenge, right? I mean, especially when it costs this much money and you need this much firepower to train a new language model, it becomes really challenging to add something meaningful. But the other thing is, a lot of the startups now are just saying, look, we can use this technology to improve something we're already doing. And a lot of the companies are starting to integrate generative AI and AI-based analysis and that kind of stuff into their own workflows. That doesn't make you an AI startup, to be clear, but I think it's like, you'd be crazy not to use it as a tool. And as these tools get better and cheaper, things are going to get really interesting.
I also think there's just a lot of opportunity for startups to kind of focus on, similar to what we're talking about a little bit with Pay-HOA earlier, it's the areas that maybe aren't a good fit for a Google or an OpenAI to really come in and own. Like I've talked to a couple companies who do like very vertical specific AI, like closed loop systems, whether it's stuff related to like the legal system, or we had a company I found a few months ago that uses AI systems to essentially like help make like benefit applications easier, like reading through the documents, making sure you have the right stuff, like things like that. Like Google would have no business. Well, I mean, they would maybe have a different answer, but why would they get into legal document closed loop AI? Like, it's like there's a lot of areas where I think startups can come in and own really well, and that the big companies, it would be like a part of their business that I just don't know if they would necessarily be nimble enough to like spend enough time and attention doing that small vertical approach, or if it would even make sense for them at all.
Yeah. The question becomes, what can this company add that is unique enough that another company can't swoop in and eat their lunch? I think that's going to be a really big challenge. Like, everybody can access a whole bunch of legal documents. Legal documents is a particularly interesting one because a lot of that is public, right?
Right.
You can scrape a court and get hundreds and hundreds of thousands of documents and train an AI on that. Well, so can anybody else. So it becomes kind of a, what is the magic sauce? Either unique data set or something that a startup can do that sets them apart from every other startup to do this.
Yeah. The question at the end of the day is Google or Microsoft or OpenAI, are they going to invent AI to track birds and wind turbines? And if not, we still have use for startups.
Absolutely. But I think the key thing here becomes you could also start a startup, feed a lot of pictures of birds into an AI and have something there, right? Google isn't going to solve the niche problem, but you still have all the other startups that could fight here. So the question becomes, what is the unique selling point, or what is the unique thing about this startup? Because once this company comes out, if they have no defendability, the challenge becomes, what is going to stop 30 other startups from doing it slightly better, slightly different, slightly whatever? And I think in the process of defending your raison d'être, it becomes a real challenge for startups.
Yeah. And there was some other news, for example, some personnel changes. We had OpenAI's co-founder and longtime chief scientist left the company, which was kind of a big deal. But that personnel change is not the only type of departure we're seeing this year. We've had a ton of movement in the venture capital world, with VCs left and right leaving firms. Becca, you've dug into this. What is going on? Why are so many VCs leaving their firms, and what the heck are they doing next?
This has been really interesting to watch this year because, of course, any market, anytime, you do see VCs move around to some extent. But the most common move you see is someone at a firm who either leaves to launch their own, or who hits a point where they take a job at a different fund where they would be able to sort of take that next step that would just take them much longer where they were. But what's particularly interesting about this year is we're seeing a lot of big names that we know switch funds. And these are people who are not at the associate, at the vice president level. These are people who are partners, general partners, in some cases, key mans on different funds. And they are leaving either to start their own funds, or we've had a couple cases of Miles Grimshaw and Keith Raboy being boomerangs, going back to old funds they were at before, which is something we don't generally see very often. So the fact that we're seeing so much movement, we're seeing like little trends like that appear is super interesting. The other thing that's crazy about this is, yes, people spin out of firms to launch their own. That's not new to this specific batch of VCs, but the startup market right now is terrible for that. Like, fundraising was so bad in 2023 for venture funds and especially emerging managers. And this year, from the LPs I've talked to sort of throughout the first couple months of the year, they actually think this year might be worse. So it's very interesting that we're not only seeing this much movement, but seeing so much movement with people going to launch things that it's just really not a good time for.
Yeah, it feels bold. I'm wondering what their thinking is, why they feel like they want to try to do something so adventurous at a time like this. I find that curious as well. We've seen at least, Vik Singh left ENIAC Ventures after 15 years to launch a new firm of his own. Ethan Kurzweil left his role as a partner at Bessemer Venture Partners after 16 years to launch an early stage focused investment firm, along with Christina Shen, who left Andreessen Horowitz after 4 years, and Mark Goldberg, who left Index Ventures after 8 years last fall.
Yeah. The other thing that I think is interesting too, and you just touched on it a bit, is that we're seeing people who founded firms leaving to found a firm, which is so, of course, like you get, and I know, Haje, we were talking about this a bit, but of course it's like when you're at a fund and you have LP capital, there are agreements of kind of like where you're going to be investing. And of course, LPs don't really love if you just go off the rails or break those agreements or things like that. So there, of course, is reasoning behind leaving a fund to start one, even if you did launch the one that you're currently at. But it's definitely not one we see as often.
I think one of the interesting things is that founders of venture funds often get locked into an investment thesis, right? And so you go to your LPs, you raise your money, you use that thesis to raise the money. You say, hey, our idea is that there's a ton of money to be made here. Now, VCs by their nature are very future focused, and they're spending all this time thinking about what the future is going to look like. And my suspicion is that for some of these folks, either they just got bored of investing what they invested in. I mean, people get bored. But the other possibility is that they want to test out a new thesis, or they've spotted an even bigger opportunity somewhere else where they went to their LPs and their LPs are like, I like where we were investing. Mm-hmm. And then you're kind of screwed because you're not like, you can't really invest off thesis. That is generally not a great idea for a VC. And some LPAs, limited partner agreements, means that maybe there's a vice clause, or maybe there's a, hey, you only invest in this geographic region, or maybe you invest only in whatever. And if somebody says, hey, I'm seeing a massive opportunity in defense tech, well, if that's one of the things that's specifically in the LPA that you can't invest in, there is not that much you can do other than raise a separate side fund or start a new fund. And the other thing that people don't talk about a lot is that within the GP entity, these partnerships can become very contentious. And sometimes I can totally see that somebody goes, you know what, screw this, I'm out. I want to start over. I'm done fighting in these deal flow meetings and in these strategy meetings about what we actually want to do with this firm. So I kind of get it. And of course, nobody's going to come out and say that out loud to a journalist, but through back channels, there's a little bit of that going on at the moment, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure we won't always know the backstories behind what really is the reason for these VCs leaving their firms. I mean, so far, we've had about 12 of these high-profile departures this year. Of course, that's only what we know of. There's probably been more that we don't even know of, probably also many more departures of partners or associates that maybe aren't as higher level or higher profile that are happening.
Yeah, and I think the other really interesting thing is it's going to get brutal for emerging fund managers to raise their second fund. The stirrings out among LPs right now is things are going to get ugly. That has several knock-on effects. For one thing, if you're a founder raising Series A, that's going to get real tricky. If you're raising growth funding, it's going to get even harder. But it also means that emerging fund managers might be looking at their future and going, hey, I'm going to struggle to raise my next fund. Maybe I'm going to start positioning myself into somewhere where my future doesn't look quite as bleak.
And I was just going to say, the thing that kind of moves this forward is with seeing all of this movement. I know there is a VC tweeting about this last week, but talking about how if you are a founder and you get a fund to invest in you, and maybe you get a partner to join your board, and that partner leaves that fund, what happens? It's like you're now your champion, your cheerleader, the person you've been using as a sounding board now is somewhere else, but the money you have in the bank is from their previous firm. So I think as we keep seeing these things continue to happen, because I mean, I don't doubt we're done at this point. I'm sure we're going to see some more movement this year. It'll be kind of interesting to see the 6 months, the 12 months down the line of what this means for startups.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we could probably talk about this for another few hours, but we're going to have to leave it there. Equity will be back on Monday with another news roundup and pitch deck teardown from Haje. His teardowns are awesome, so definitely tune in for that. Until then, you can find me on X at Bay Area Writer, Haje at Haje, which is spelled Haje, and Equity under the handle Equity Pod on X and Threads. Becca, anything listeners should be looking out for on Found?
Of course, Found, as most of you know, is our interview format show where we bring on founders who talk about why they built their companies. We have the next 2 episodes that are coming out. They come out on Tuesdays. One is a very fun company that does food as medicine as a service. They are, if you liked learning about pay, HOAs, bootstrapping to raising venture money journey, you will like this one as well. And then after that, we have a very fun AI company that a lot of people have been talking about on the week after. So definitely stay tuned.
Your interviews are awesome. Can't wait to tune into those. So you guys don't miss them as well. We'll talk to you on Monday. Thanks for listening. Bye. Equity is produced by Teresa Loconsolo with editing by Kel. Bryce Durbin is our illustrator, and we'd like to give a big thanks to our audience development team and Henry Pickavett, who manages TechCrunch audio products. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.